the Ancestral Knife, a haunting curse across generations. In this chilling tale of supernatural horror and family curses, we follow Thomas, the third generation inheritor of a mysterious, ancient dagger passed down in his family. For generations, this blade appeared unremarkable, but when it falls into Thomas' hands, terrifying and unexplainable events unfold. The dagger's history is entwined with dark, blood-soaked legends, leading to fearsome encounters that shake Thomas to his core. As the cursed object's true nature emerges, Thomas must battle escalating dread, blood-curdling apparitions, and the haunting realization that his family's destiny is bound to the blade's sinister power. Part 1. The Legacy of the Blade. The wind shrieked like a living thing as it tore through the trees surrounding Thomas's family estate. Within the confines of the old house, shadows danced along the cracked walls, their movements a twisted mockery of the flickering candlelight. Thomas sat alone in the study, staring down at the object his dying father had thrust upon him only days before, a dagger ancient, unassuming, and stained with rust. Yet the air around it felt heavier, colder, as if it breathed on its own. The memory of his father's final moments was still raw, etched deeply into Thomas's mind. "You must keep it," his father had gasped, eyes wide with fear that even death couldn't suppress. "Guard it, and be wary. It hungers." Thomas had tried to get him to explain, to tell him what he meant by those cryptic words, but his father's gaze had already gone glassy, leaving him alone with a legacy he did not want and a responsibility he did not understand. The dagger itself was deceptively simple, a curved blade of tarnished steel, its handle worn smooth from countless hands before his. There were no jewels or markings to suggest its importance, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it watched him, studied him. He scoffed, trying to dismiss the ridiculous notion, but when he picked it up, a jolt of cold shot up his arm. It wasn't the chill of metal, it was something deeper, a frigid tendril that seemed to wrap around his bones. He dropped it instantly, his breath ragged. "You're letting fear get to you," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his dark hair. He forced a laugh, but the sound was hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the room. Shaking his head, Thomas placed the dagger back in its wooden box, a box lined with ancient carvings and symbols he couldn't decipher. "Just a relic," he said, "nothing more." That night he awoke to the sound of whispers. At first they were soft, like the rustling of leaves. He strained to hear, but the words were indistinct, slithering just beyond comprehension. He turned over, telling himself it was the wind, the creaks of an old house settling. But the whispers grew louder, insistent, as if countless voices were speaking over one another. He sat up, sweat drenching his skin. The dagger's box lay on the dresser, closed tightly exactly where he had left it. Yet the whispers seemed to come from within, a chorus of despair and malice. Fear gripped him, but Thomas forced himself to move. He crept to the box, hands trembling. When he touched the lid, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. He opened the box slowly, half expecting the blade to leap at him. It lay there, still and unassuming, but he knew better now. This was no ordinary artifact. Over the next few days, the manifestations grew worse. The air around the dagger seemed colder, charged with a malevolent energy that made his skin crawl. He tried to ignore it, locking it away, hiding it in different rooms, even burying it briefly in the garden. But every morning it was back resting atop his bedside table, gleaming in the faint light of dawn. Panic clawed at him. This was impossible, beyond reason. He tried to convince himself it was a nightmare, but deep down he knew it was all too real. The first true horror came one evening as he sat by the fire, attempting to drown his fears in brandy. The flames crackled warmly, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe he was safe. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow darker than the others crept along the floor, slithering toward him. He froze, heart pounding. The shadow paused at his feet, then stretched upward, taking form a grotesque figure with hollow eyes that wept darkness. It reached for him with clawed hands, and the room plunged into icy blackness. Thomas screamed, stumbling backward. He grabbed the dagger instinctively, its cold weight in his hand somehow grounding him. As the shadow lunged, the blade glowed with a sickly red light. He swung wildly, and the creature recoiled, its form dissipating like smoke. The light dimmed and Thomas collapsed, gasping. The whispers returned, this time clearer. Blood, sacrifice, legacy. He spent the following days in a haze of terror and exhaustion. The shadow appeared often, always testing him, always driven back by the dagger's unnatural glow. It fed on his fear, growing stronger with every encounter. The whispers spoke to him of bloodlines, of deals struck long ago, of a curse bound to his family's name. Thomas scoured the family library, seeking answers in dusty tomes and forgotten journals. He found mentions of the dagger scattered throughout their history, a dark object that had brought power, ruin, and death in equal measure. His grandfather Richard had written extensively about it, documenting its appearances and the tragedies that followed. In one entry, Richard recounted a night when the blade had been used in a desperate bid to save a life. A neighbor's child lay dying, and Richard, in a moment of madness, had drawn the dagger. It had pulsed with a dark energy, and for a brief moment the child had gasped, his eyes flickering open. But then blood poured from his mouth, and his body contorted in agony. He died screaming, and the dagger glowed red for days afterward. Thomas felt sick reading the words. He knew now that the dagger demanded blood, a price for its power, a toll for its curse. He wanted nothing more than to destroy it, to rid himself of its taint. He tried fire, but the flames recoiled. He tried hammers and saws, but the blade remained unscathed. Despair sank in. He was trapped, the latest in a line of unwilling keepers. One night, as he lay in bed, the whispers changed. They spoke directly to him, promising power, riches, safety, if he would only give in. Just one life, they hissed. A small sacrifice. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the words burrowed deep, tempting him, corrupting him, corrupting him. He saw visions of what the dagger could offer, wealth beyond measure, enemies struck down, untold strength. It showed him his deepest desires and darkest fears, twisting them into a cruel mockery. He wept, torn between revulsion and temptation. The shadows grew bolder, manifesting even in daylight. They whispered of a ritual that could free him, a blood offering that would bind the dagger's power to him alone. Thomas resisted, but he felt the blade's pull, its hunger. He grew gaunt, his eyes hollow. Friends and family noticed, but he pushed them away. He couldn't risk their lives. The dagger's curse was his burden. The breaking point came on a stormy night. Lightning flashed, illuminating the twisted shapes that now haunted every corner of his home. Shadows closed in, their eyes glowing with malevolence. Thomas clutched the dagger, his hand steady despite his trembling body. "I will not give in," he whispered, voice cracking. "You will not win." The shadows laughed, a cacophony of mocking voices. They surged forward, and the dagger blazed to life. The battle that followed was a blow of pain and desperation. He fought with everything he had, slashing at the darkness, feeling it bite and claw at him. Blood stained the floor, his blood, and the dagger drank deeply, its glow intensifying. The shadows howled and recoiled, their forms unraveling. When it was over, Thomas collapsed, the dagger slipping from his grip. He awoke to silence. The whispers were gone, the shadows banished for now. But the dagger lay beside him, its red light dim but persistent. Thomas knew it was far from over. This was only the beginning. The curse was awake, and it would not rest until it had consumed everything. He stood, his body bruised and broken, his spirit battered but not defeated. He would fight. He would uncover the truth, and he would find a way to end this curse, no matter the cost. Part 2. An Ominous Origin. The year was 1932, and the world outside was a storm of economic despair and political unrest. In the quiet, wind-swept countryside where Richard's family farm stood, however, life was a different kind of struggle. Days were long and hard, but at night the wind whispered secrets through the groaning trees, and shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. Richard had grown accustomed to such peculiarities in his years on the land, but nothing could have prepared him for the day he acquired the dagger that would forever change his family's fate. It happened during one of Richard's rare trips to the trading outpost on the fringes of the province. Merchants from across distant lands had gathered to barter their exotic wares, spices, silks, relics, and oddities that spoke of forgotten ages. Richard had gone to trade crops and livestock, hoping to secure much-needed tools for the farm. Instead, he found himself drawn to a pair of traveling merchants standing apart from the crowd. Their wagon was shrouded in heavy cloth, their voices low and guarded as they spoke to each other in a tongue he did not understand. Curiosity got the better of him. "You there," Richard called, his voice firm but polite. The merchants turned, their faces partially obscured by wide-brimmed hats and thick scarves. Their eyes, though black as night and unblinking, seemed to pierce straight through him. Richard suppressed a shiver. "What are you selling?" The taller of the two stepped forward, pulling something from beneath his cloak with deliberate slowness. "A relic of great mystery," he said, his words laced with an accent Richard couldn't place. He revealed a dagger, its blade tarnished and its handle intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the light. "It is said to hold ancient power," Richard scoffed, masking his unease with bravado. A rusty knife. He leaned closer, drawn despite himself. The dagger's surface caught the light, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw it pulse like something alive. "Not just any knife," the merchant replied, his voice low and hypnotic. "This blade is older than the stones beneath our feet. It chose its master." "Rubbish," Richard muttered, but he could not tear his gaze away. He extended a hand, and the merchant hesitated before placing the dagger in his palm. The moment their hands met, a jolt of cold shot through Richard's arm, settling deep in his chest. He grunted, nearly dropping it. "Heavy, isn't it?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The merchants exchanged a glance. Indeed, the shorter one whispered, barely audible. Richard wanted to walk away, to toss the dagger back and forget the encounter. But something about it, its weight, its texture, the way it seemed to hum in his grasp, called to him. Against his better judgment, he struck a deal. He traded goods far more valuable than he should have, driven by an impulse he couldn't name. As he walked away, the merchants vanished into the mist, leaving no trace of their presence behind. Back at the farm, Richard's wife, Margaret, took one look at the dagger and recoiled. "What have you brought home?" she demanded, crossing herself. The air around the blade felt colder, heavier, and she wanted nothing to do with it. Richard laughed, but the sound was hollow. "It's just a trinket," he said, though even he didn't believe his own words. He placed it in a drawer and tried to forget about it. For weeks, life continued as normal. The crops grew tall, the livestock thrived, and Richard convinced himself that the dagger was nothing more than a curiosity gathering dust. But that all changed one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the fields in hues of blood red and shadow. One of the farm's prized cows collapsed without warning, its body contorting in a way that seemed unnatural, almost grotesque. Richard and Margaret rushed to the barn, but by the time they arrived it was too late. The animal lay motionless, its eyes wide and glassy. Margaret wept, but Richard stared at the carcass, a cold dread creeping up his spine. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and for a brief horrifying moment he thought he heard a low whisper like the wind but sharper, more insistent. He shook his head, dismissing it as fatigue. The next day another animal died, and then another. Chickens, goats, pigs all succumbed, their bodies marked by strange bruises and gashes that no predator could have inflicted. Panic spread through the household. Neighbors whispered of curses and hexes. Some urged Richard to seek a priest, but he refused. pride or perhaps something darker compelled him to keep the truth hidden. He knew deep down that the dagger was to blame. He could feel its pull, its hunger growing stronger with each death. One night, Richard awoke to find himself standing in the barn, the dagger in his hand. He had no memory of leaving his bed, no recollection of how he got there. Blood dripped from the blade, pooling at his feet. Horror seized him as he realized he was standing over the body of a slaughtered lamb, one he had raised from birth. He stumbled backward, dropping the dagger. It landed with a dull thud, but the sound reverberated through him like a death knell. Margaret found him there, pale and shaking. She took one look at the blood-streaked dagger and knew. "It's evil," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to destroy it," they tried. Together they built a roaring fire hotter than any they'd ever made. Richard hurled the dagger into the flames, but instead of melting, it glowed a deep, malevolent red. The fire roared higher, crackling with an unnatural fury, and the air filled with a shrill, inhuman wail. Margaret screamed, covering her ears, while Richard stood frozen, unable to look away. When the flames died down, the dagger lay unscathed among the ashes. Desperation turned to fear, and fear gave way to hopelessness. Richard tried burying the blade, casting it into the river, even offering it back to the merchants he had acquired it from. But no matter what he did, it always returned, waiting for him in the darkness. He began to waste away, haunted by whispers and shadows that only he could see. He slept little, ate less, and spoke to no one, not even Margaret. One evening, as he sat alone in the kitchen, the whispers grew deafening. They spoke of blood that would seal a pact, blood that would end the torment. Richard clutched the dagger, his knuckles white. He felt its power thrumming beneath his skin, promising relief if he would only give in. The shadows in the room lengthened, creeping closer. He raised the blade to his wrist, tears streaming down his face. At the last moment, Margaret burst into the room, her face a mask of determination and fear. "No," she cried, wrenching the dagger from his grasp. "You will not take him." She wrapped the blade in cloth and hid it away, hoping that distance would weaken its hold. But the dagger's influence could not be so easily banished. Over the following years, tragedy struck again and again. Neighbors died mysteriously. Fields withered overnight. The whispers never truly ceased. Richard became a shell of the man he once was, consumed by guilt and fear. The day he passed the dagger to his son, he did so with trembling hands, whispering a single plea: break the curse. As Thomas read his grandfather's journals decades later, he understood the terrible weight he had inherited. The dagger was not merely an object, it was a prison, a parasite that fed on fear and blood. And now it was his burden to bear. Part 3. The Awakening of the Curse. The air was thick with the mingling scents of roasted meat, fresh bread, and the faintest hint of jasmine from Margaret's garden. Laughter echoed through the halls of Thomas's ancestral home, as family members, young and old, gathered to celebrate the season's harvest. Children chased each other through the corridors, their shrieks of delight mingling with the clinking of glasses. For a brief, fleeting moment, Thomas allowed himself to believe that everything would be all right, that the weight pressing down on him was just in his mind, that the dagger now hidden away was nothing more than a twisted piece of metal from an old, forgotten legend. He wanted to believe it so desperately. As night fell and the lanterns were lit, casting warm, golden light throughout the main hall, Thomas felt a pang of unease. It was subtle at first, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. But as the minutes passed, the feeling grew a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a cold weight in the pit of his stomach. He tried to shake it off, to immerse himself in conversation and drink, but the feeling clung to him, a shadow he could not escape. His cousin Elizabeth noticed his distraction. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft with concern. "Are you all right?" He forced a smile, hoping it would reach his eyes. "Just tired, Lizzie. It's been a long week." She frowned, clearly unconvinced, but let the matter drop as their uncle stood to propose a toast. Glasses were raised, voices cheered, and for a moment the heaviness lifted. Thomas drank deeply, savoring the burn of the wine. But when he lowered his glass, his gaze fell on the wooden box at the far end of the room, the box that held the dagger. His heart skipped a beat. It should have been locked away, hidden from sight. Yet there it was, its carvings catching the light in a way that made them seem to writhe and twist. Panic surged through him. He excused himself hurriedly, weaving through the crowd as his vision blurred. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if unseen hands were pulling him back. When he reached the box, he saw that the latch was undone. The lid lay slightly ajar. His hands trembled as he lifted it. The dagger lay inside, unchanged or so it seemed at first glance, but as he stared he noticed a thin, crimson line running along its edge. Blood, fresh and glistening. His breath caught in his throat. He recoiled, nearly knocking over a chair. "It's not possible," he whispered. No one had touched the blade. It had cut nothing. And yet the blood was real, dripping slowly onto the velvet lining of the box. He wiped a hand across his brow, feeling the cold sweat that now soaked his skin. He wanted to run, to leave the cursed object and never look back. But he couldn't. The dagger held him fast, its presence suffocating. A sudden crash shattered the tension. A glass had fallen, spilling wine across the table. Family members laughed nervously, but Thomas barely heard them. He closed the box with shaking hands, forcing himself to smile as he turned back to the room. Just a strange trick of the light, he told himself, even as dread coiled tighter around his chest. The evening wore on, but Thomas could not escape the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to creep closer when he wasn't looking. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him until every breath felt like a struggle. The dagger's whispers began as a low hum at the edge of his hearing, growing louder with each passing minute. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the voices slipped through, cold and cruel. Blood. Blood must flow. He stumbled into the hallway, desperate for air. The walls seemed to close in, their wooden panels warping and shifting. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms. "This isn't real," he muttered. "It's just the wine, just stress, but deep down, he knew better." He barely noticed Elizabeth following him until she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, you're scaring me." "What's happening?" He turned to her, eyes wide with fear. I don't know." His voice broke. "Something's wrong." It's the dagger she'd paled but held his gaze. "Then we'll destroy it. I've tried," he whispered. "I've tried everything." Before she could respond, the whisper surged, a deafening roar that drowned out all thought. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting the hallway in darkness. A chill wind swept through, bringing with it the stench of decay. Thomas's breath came in short, ragged gasps. "No," he said, clutching at his chest. "Not now." The dagger's box burst open with a force that sent it crashing to the floor. The blade glowed with a sickly red light, pulsing like a beating heart. Blood poured from its edge, pooling around it in a dark, viscous mass. The shadows around them came alive, twisting and writhing as they took shape, faceless figures with clawed hands and hollow eyes. Elizabeth screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Thomas grabbed the dagger, its cold weight anchoring him. Pain shot through his arm, as if the blade were biting into him. "Stay back," he shouted, though he knew it was futile. The shadows closed in, their touch cold and suffocating. They whispered of death, of endless torment, of the blood that must be paid. In a surge of desperation, Thomas slashed at the air. The dagger blazed with a blinding light, and the shadows recoiled, shrieking in agony. For a moment silence reigned. But then the light dimmed, and Thomas felt the blade's hunger deep and insatiable. It wanted more. It demanded more. The shadows lunged again, their forms growing stronger. One latched onto Thomas's arm, its touch burning like ice. He cried out, swinging the dagger wildly. Blood sprayed across the walls, not from the blade, but from his own wounds. The dagger pulsed, feeding off his pain, his fear. It was alive, and it was in control. Elizabeth grabbed his other arm, pulling him back. "You have to let go," she cried. "It's killing you, I can't," he gasped, tears streaming down his face. "It won't let me." With a strength born of desperation, she tore the dagger from his grasp and hurled it down the hall. The shadows howled, their forms flickering and fading. The dagger landed with a clang, its light dimming once more. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting if only slightly. Thomas collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Elizabeth knelt beside him, her hands shaking. "We have to end this," she whispered, voice thick with fear and determination. He nodded, too weak to speak. The dagger's curse had awakened, and it would not rest until its hunger was sated. They had seen only the beginning of its horrors, but together they would fight until the bitter end. Part 4. Nightmares and Shadows. The nights were no longer Thomas's own. He would lie down, exhausted from days spent battling unseen forces, only for darkness to welcome him with open arms and a cruel smile. Sleep was no escape, it was merely another battlefield where he was helpless and alone. Each night, as he drifted into unconsciousness, the dagger's curse took hold, dragging him deeper into a twisted realm of nightmares and shadows. It began subtly at first. Images of the dagger would flash behind his closed eyelids, fleeting glimpses of its blade glistening with an unnatural light. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the taste of blood thick on his tongue. He dismissed these dreams as the product of his fraying nerves, but soon the visions grew stronger, more vivid. One night he found himself standing in a vast expanse of darkness. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the ground beneath him pulsed like a heartbeat. Shadows swirled around him, whispering in voices that were all too familiar: his father, his grandfather, his ancestors long dead. Thomas they called, their tones a mix of despair and rage. "We cannot escape," he turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but the shadows moved like smoke, always just out of reach. Then they solidified. The figures stepped forward, their faces pale and twisted. His father, hollow-eyed and gaunt, reached out with skeletal fingers. "You have failed us," he rasped, his voice echoing with countless others. "No." Thomas stumbled back, shaking his head. "I didn't ask for this." The shadows closed in, their touch icy and suffocating. They pressed against his skin, seeping into his pores, filling him with their anguish. He tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed his voice. Just as he thought he would drown in their despair, a sharp pain lanced through his chest. He looked down to see the dagger in his hand, its blade buried deep in his own flesh. Blood poured out, staining the ground, and the shadows recoiled, hissing. Thomas woke with a start, clutching his chest. The pain lingered, phantom but real enough to leave him gasping for air. The dagger lay on his nightstand, its edge glistening with a faint red light. He had locked it away the night before, buried it deep in the cellar beneath layers of stone and steel. Yet here it was, mocking him. He hurled it across the room, but even as it clattered to the floor, he knew it would return. The days blurred together, each one a repetition of dread and exhaustion. Shadows followed him wherever he went. In the corners of rooms, in the reflection of mirrors, in the flickering of candles, all is there, watching. The air in his home grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay. He could barely bring himself to eat. Every bite tasted like ash. His body weakened, his skin grew pale, and dark circles framed his haunted eyes. Friends and neighbors noticed the change. "You look ill," they would say, their voices tinged with concern and fear. But he pushed them away, too terrified to explain. The whispers were constant now, a chorus of voices that spoke of blood and sacrifice, of power and despair. "We are bound," they would say. "There is no escape." Sometimes they promised him relief, an end to the torment, if only he would give in. Other times they mocked him, reminding him of his failures, of the countless lives the dagger had consumed. He tried to drown them out with drink, but the voices only laughed, their tones cruel and mocking. One night, as he sat by the dying embers of the fireplace, the shadows moved. They coalesced into a single form, a tall, thin figure with eyes like burning coals. It stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring his fear. Thomas gripped the dagger, its cold weight familiar in his hand. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The shadow smiled, a cruel twist of its mouth. "You know what it wants," it said, its voice a blend of countless others. "It wants blood. It always has." Thomas's grip tightened. "No, I won't give it what it wants." The shadow laughed, a sound that made the air vibrate. "You have no choice. You are its keeper, bound by blood. It will consume you, as it consumed those before you. I'll find a way to destroy it," Thomas said, more to himself than to the shadow. "Many have tried," the figure whispered, stepping closer. "All have failed." With a sudden burst of rage, Thomas lunged, slashing at the shadow. The dagger glowed with a sickly red light, cutting through the darkness. For a moment, the figure wavered, its form flickering, but then it surged forward, enveloping him. Cold tendrils wrapped around his body, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Images flashed before his eyes, his ancestors, their lives destroyed by the curse, the blood they had spilled, the despair that had consumed them. He saw himself, hollow-eyed and broken, the dagger clutched in his hand as the shadows claimed him. No, he fought back with everything he had, summoning every ounce of strength left in his battered body. The dagger pulsed, and the shadow screamed, retreating into the darkness. Thomas collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The whispers receded, but their presence lingered, a constant reminder of the battle he could not escape. The days grew darker. Thomas' health continued to decline. He could feel the dagger's influence burrowing deeper, twisting his thoughts, sapping his will. He became paranoid, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement. Sleep was a cruel joke, a gateway to nightmares that left him more exhausted than before. He dreamed of rituals drenched in blood, of shadowy figures chanting in a language he couldn't understand. He saw himself standing atop a stone altar, the dagger raised high, his hands stained with blood. When he awoke, his hands would still be trembling, the echoes of those screams ringing in his ears. One evening, he awoke to find himself standing in the garden, the dagger in his hand. He had no memory of leaving his bed, no recollection of how he got there. The ground beneath him was stained with blood. He looked down, horrified, but found no wounds on his own body. "What have I done?" he whispered, dropping the blade. The earth seemed to pulse beneath his feet, as if mocking him. The dagger's hold tightened. It began to appear in places it shouldn't. On his desk, at the foot of his bed, even in his pocket. No matter how many times he locked it away, it always found its way back. The shadows grew bolder, their whispers more insistent. They spoke of the blood debt, of the sacrifices required to keep the curse at bay. "It will never end," they told him, "not until you give in." Thomas's mind frayed. He isolated himself, afraid of what he might do, of who he might hurt. The faces of his ancestors haunted him, their hollow eyes filled with accusation and despair. "You are weak," they whispered. "You cannot break the curse." He tried to resist, to hold on to his sanity, but each day was a losing battle. Then came the night when the shadows took form once more. They surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. The air grew cold, and the dagger pulsed with a blinding light. "It is time," they said, their voices a symphony of despair. "The curse demands blood," no, Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I won't do it." The shadows closed in, their touch like ice. Pain lanced through his body, and he fell to his knees. "It will consume you," they whispered. "You cannot resist." Thomas clutched the dagger, tears streaming down his face. "I will find a way," he whispered. "I will end this." The shadows laughed, a sound that echoed through the halls of his home. "Then fight, Thomas. But know this, you are already lost." The light of dawn broke through the window, casting away the shadows. But the weight of the curse remained heavier than ever. Thomas knew the battle was far from over. The dagger's grip tightened with each passing day, drawing him deeper into its darkness. But he would fight no matter the cost. He had to. Part 5. Touch of Death. The wind outside had begun to howl again, rattling the shutters of the old estate and seeping icy drafts through every crack. Thomas barely noticed. He stood in the dim glow of candlelight, staring down at the dagger resting on the table. Its cold metal seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a void that whispered of darkness and death. For days he had tried to understand its power, to unravel the secrets that had bound his family to its curse for generations. But the dagger resisted him at every turn, mocking his efforts with each new failure. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as if the dagger's malevolent presence was suffocating him. He reached out, hesitating only for a moment before his fingers brushed against the hilt. Pain shot up his arm, a freezing, burning agony that made him gasp. He pulled his hand back, staring at the faint, blackened mark on his palm. The dagger's power was growing, its influence spreading like a disease. He had to find a way to end this before it consumed him completely. Lost in his thoughts, Thomas didn't hear the door creak open. His mother stepped into the room, her soft footsteps muffled by the thick rug. "Thomas," she called gently, concern etched into her features. "You haven't slept in days," he turned to her, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "I can't, Mother, not while this thing is here." She approached cautiously, her gaze falling on the dagger. Her expression shifted from concern to fear. "That blade, it's cursed, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak. How could he explain the horrors he had seen, the shadows that haunted his every step? The words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his guilt and despair. "You need help," she said softly, reaching for him. "Let me." Her movement was so quick, so instinctive that Thomas had no time to react. Her hand brushed against the dagger's blade, and the air around them exploded with energy. A blinding light filled the room, accompanied by a sound like 1,000 whispers screaming at once. Thomas was thrown back, hitting the wall with bone-jarring force. The impact left him dazed, but through the ringing in his ears, he heard his mother scream a sound that would haunt him forever. He forced himself to move, every muscle protesting. "Mother," he cried, stumbling toward her. She lay crumpled on the floor, her hand outstretched. The flesh was blackened and blistered, smoke rising from the seared skin. Her eyes were wide with shock and pain, and her chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. "No, no, no," Thomas muttered, panic clawing at him. He knelt beside her, afraid to touch her for fear of making it worse. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "This is my fault." Her eyes found his, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition. "What have you done?" she rasped, each word a struggle. "It's the dagger," he said, tears streaming down his face. "It's cursed. I didn't mean." A violent convulsion racked her body, cutting him off. Her back arched, and a strangled cry escaped her lips. Thomas felt helpless, paralyzed by fear and guilt. Shadows crept along the edges of the room, drawn to her pain like vultures to carrion. They hovered, writhing and twisting, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness that birthed them. The dagger pulsed with a sickening red light, feeding off her suffering. No, Thomas growled, fury igniting within him. He grabbed the dagger, ignoring the searing cold that burned his palm. "You will not take her," the shadows hissed, recoiling from the blade's light. But they did not retreat. Instead, they circled closer, their whispers merging into a cacophony of malice and despair. "The price must be paid," they intoned, their voices like a death knell. Desperation drove him to action. He lifted his mother into his arms, her body limp and fragile, and stumbled toward the door. The dagger's whispers followed him, a cruel reminder of the curse that had bound his family for generations. He barely noticed the rain as he carried her outside, each step an agony of fear and guilt. The carriage was waiting, its driver pale and wide-eyed. Without a word, Thomas placed his mother inside and climbed in after her. The journey to the healer's home was a blur, the clatter of hooves drowned out by the pounding of his heart. When they arrived, Thomas pounded on the door until his fists were raw. The old healer answered, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight before her. "Bring her in," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Hours passed in a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. Thomas paced the small room, his mind racing. The dagger's influence was spreading, and he was powerless to stop it. He could still feel its pull, even here, miles away. It was as if it had burrowed into his soul, tethering him to its dark power. The healer emerged at dawn, her expression grim. "She is stable for now," she said, "but whatever touched her left a mark that goes beyond the physical." "I have done all I can," Thomas nodded numbly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He entered the room where his mother lay, her breathing shallow and labored. She looked so fragile, so broken. Guilt clawed at him, a relentless torment that mirrored the dagger's whispers. "This is my fault," he said, sinking to his knees beside her bed. "I should have protected you." Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment there was clarity amidst the pain. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice weak but resolute. "This curse must end. Promise me." "I will," he vowed, his voice trembling with emotion. "I swear it." But how could he keep that promise? The dagger's power was ancient and insidious, its grip tightening with each passing day. He had tried to destroy it, to banish it, but it always returned stronger, more malevolent. And now it had hurt the one person he loved most. Rage and determination burned away his fear. He would find a way to break the curse, no matter the cost. The journey home was somber, the air heavy with dread. Thomas carried the dagger with him, its weight a constant reminder of his failure. As he entered the house, the shadows stirred, sensing his resolve. The whispers were louder now, mocking him, tempting him, warning him. "You cannot defeat us," they said. "You are bound by blood." Thomas ignored them. He lit candles in every room, banishing the darkness as best he could. He gathered every book, every scrap of lore his family had kept on the dagger. There had to be something, anything that could lead him to a solution. Days turned into nights, and still he searched, driven by desperation and the memory of his mother's pained eyes. The shadows grew restless, their forms more solid than before. They prowled the edges of his vision, whispering of doom. The dagger pulsed with an unnatural light, its hunger growing. It demanded blood, and it would not be denied. One evening, as he pored over a crumbling journal, a passage caught his eye. It spoke of a ritual, one that could sever the bond between the dagger and its keeper, but the cost was steep, a life freely given, a sacrifice made in blood. Thomas's hand shook as he read the words. Was this the answer he had been searching for? Or was it another trap, another way for the dagger to tighten its grip? He didn't know, but he had no choice. Time was running out. He closed the book and rose, determination hardening in his chest. The shadows watched, their eyes gleaming with malice. The whispers rose to a crescendo, filling the room with their cacophony. "You will fail," they said. "You are weak." Thomas lifted the dagger, its cold weight a familiar burden. "We'll see," he whispered, his voice filled with defiance. The battle was far from over, but he would fight. For his mother. For his family. For himself. Part 6. The truth revealed. The sky was an ominous shade of grey as Thomas rode out the village, the dagger wrapped tightly in thick cloth and hidden beneath his cloak. He could feel its cold weight pressing against his chest, a constant reminder of the curse that had plagued his family for generations. The wind howled around him, carrying whispers that made his blood run cold. Shadows seemed to stretch and reach for him, their forms dancing at the edge of his vision. He urged his horse faster, desperate to escape their grasp, though he knew it was futile. The darkness clung to him like a second skin, and it would follow him wherever he went. His destination was the small, isolated cottage of the village elder, a man named Elias, known for his vast knowledge of ancient lore and dark secrets that others dared not speak of. Thomas had avoided him for years, dismissing the old man as a relic of a forgotten time. But now he had no choice. The dagger's power was growing, and his mother's life hung by a thread. He needed answers, no matter how dark or dangerous they might be. As he reached the edge of the forest, the wind died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Thomas dismounted and tied his horse to a gnarled tree, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the dagger pulsing beneath his cloak, as if it sensed his fear and fed off it. He clenched his jaw and marched toward the cottage, each step heavier than the last. The door creaked open before he could knock, revealing Elias's gaunt figure silhouetted against the dim light of a single candle. The elder's eyes were sharp and piercing, as if they could see straight into Thomas's soul. "You've come," Elias said, his voice a low rasp. "I was expecting you," Thomas swallowed hard. "You know why I'm here." Elias stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The air inside the cottage was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with ancient tomes, jars filled with strange substances, and relics that whispered of forgotten times. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The old man gestured to a chair by the fire. "Sit." Thomas obeyed, his gaze never leaving Elias. The elder moved with a slow, deliberate grace, settling into a chair opposite him. "You carry the blade," Elias said, his eyes flicking to the bundle beneath Thomas's cloak. Thomas hesitated, then unwrapped the dagger and placed it on the table between them. The air grew colder and the shadows in the room seemed to shiver. "I need to know what it is," Thomas said, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay calm. "I need to know how to end this curse." Elias leaned forward, his expression grave. "The blade you hold is far more than a weapon. It is a vessel, a prison for a malevolent spirit that has haunted your bloodline for centuries. It was forged in blood, tempered by dark rites, and bound to your family by a pact made long ago." Thomas's stomach twisted. "A pact?" The elder nodded, his gaze never wavering. "Centuries ago, one of your ancestors sought power beyond his reach. He was a man of ambition, driven by greed and desperation. The details of his plight have been lost to time, but his actions remain. He summoned a spirit, a being of darkness and malice, and bound it to the blade, believing he could control it. But he was a fool. The spirit was too powerful, and the binding came at a terrible cost." Thomas's mouth went dry. "What cost the spirit demanded blood," Elias said, his voice heavy with the weight of the past. "To keep it dormant, to contain its power, a life had to be taken, a sacrifice made willingly or not. Your ancestor paid the price, but the binding was imperfect. The spirit twisted the pact, ensuring that every generation would suffer the same curse. The blade would pass from parent to child, and with it, the burden of sacrifice." Thomas's mind reeled. He had suspected that his family's curse was ancient, but this was worse than he had imagined. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would anyone do this power?" Elias said simply. "Your ancestor believed he could wield the spirit's strength, that he could become something more than human. But he was deceived. The spirit took everything from him, leaving only despair and death in its wake." Thomas stared at the dagger, bile rising in his throat. And now it once more the elder's eyes narrowed. "The spirit is bound to the blade, but its hunger has grown over the centuries. It feeds on pain, fear, and blood. Each sacrifice only delays its awakening. The more it is denied, the stronger it becomes. It is a parasite, and your family is its host." Rage and despair warred within Thomas. There must be a way to end this, to break the curse. Elias leaned back, his expression weary. "There is, but it is not a simple thing. The bond between the spirit and the blade can be severed, but the cost is steep. It requires a life freely given, a sacrifice made with full knowledge of what it entails. Only then can the spirit be banished." Thomas's blood ran cold. "A sacrifice," the elder nodded. "One who understands the price, who willingly offers their life to break the curse." Thomas's mind raced. The weight of the dagger's curse had already claimed so much: his peace, his health, his mother's safety. And now it demanded more. He thought of his ancestors, of the lives lost to the blade's insidious hunger. He thought of his mother, lying in a sick bed, her life hanging by a thread. He would not let this curse take anyone else. There must be another way, he said, his voice cracking. Anything else, Elias' gaze softened, but his words were unyielding. I have searched for years, Thomas. I have scoured every text, every legend. This is the only way. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The fire crackled, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Thomas felt the weight of the dagger pressing down on him, its whispers coiling around his mind. It would not let him go, not without blood. I can't, he whispered, tears blurring his vision. I can't do it. Elias reached across the table, his hand resting on Thomas's. You are stronger than you know, he said. But the choice is yours. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, as if listening, waiting. The dagger's pulse quickened, sensing his hesitation. Thomas's thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, anger, and desperation. He wanted to throw the blade into the fire, to see it melt into nothingness. But he knew it would never be that easy. The curse was bound to him, to his bloodline. It would haunt him until he found a way to end it. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Thank you, he said, his voice hollow. I need time. Elias nodded, understanding in his eyes. Be careful, Thomas. The spirit will fight to keep its hold on you. It will exploit your fears, your doubts. You must be strong, Thomas nodded, though he felt anything but strong. He wrapped the dagger in cloth once more and left the cottage, the weight of the curse pressing down on him like a vice. The journey back to the village was a blur. Shadows followed him, whispering of failure, of blood, of the inevitable. He ignored them, focusing on the path ahead. He would not let the dagger win. He would find a way to break the curse no matter the cost. Back at the estate, the air was thick with tension. The shadows were stronger now, their forms more solid. They prowled the halls, their eyes gleaming with malice. The dagger's whispers were louder, more insistent. Blood, give us blood, they demanded. Thomas gripped the dagger tightly, his knuckles white. You will not take me, he said, his voice trembling but determined. The shadows laughed a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the halls. We already have. Part 7. Desperation and Defiance. The storm's fury outside matched the chaos within Thomas's mind. The wind howled, rattling the old manor's windows as sheets of rain hammered against the glass. Lightning illuminated the darkened study, briefly casting twisted shadows that writhed like living things. At the room's center lay the dagger wrapped tightly in cloth, bound with iron chains, and still pulsing with an unnatural red light that seemed to pierce through its bindings. Thomas felt its presence as a suffocating weight pressing against his chest, a gnawing, insidious force that refused to be contained. You cannot destroy me, the dagger whispered, its voice like cold silk brushing against his thoughts. You are weak, Thomas. Just as they were, Thomas closed his eyes, trying to block out the voice, but it was useless. The whispers crept into every crevice of his mind, cold tendrils of doubt and despair wrapping around his resolve. I am not like them, he said through gritted teeth, his hands trembling with fatigue and fury. I will end this. The dagger's laughter was a low, mocking hum that resonated in his bones. You will fail, it said. You will become mine just as they did. It is inevitable. Thomas turned away from the blade, desperate to escape its influence, even if only for a moment. But the whispers followed him, relentless and unyielding. He stumbled to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The rain outside blurred the world into a haze, but even that was a welcome reprieve from the darkness clawing at him from within. For he had to find a way to end the curse. It was the only thought that kept him moving, the only spark of hope in the suffocating darkness. For weeks he had combed through ancient texts, scoured every scrap of lore his family had collected over generations. He had tried everything, sealing the blade in iron, burying it deep beneath the earth, casting it into the river. But it always returned, its presence more oppressive, its power more consuming. It fed on his fear, his doubt, his despair. And now it was stronger than ever. Thomas. He flinched at the sound of his own name, spoken with a familiarity that made his skin crawl. He turned slowly, his eyes drawn to the dagger despite himself. It lay motionless, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as if reality itself were warping under its influence. Shadows pooled at the edges of the room, stretching and coiling like serpents. "You are tired," the dagger said, its voice soft and persuasive. "I can make it stop. All you have to do is surrender never." The word came out as a whisper, but it was laced with all the defiance he could muster. He crossed the room, each step heavy with exhaustion, and grabbed the satchel he had prepared. It contained what few tools and relics he thought might help him: charms of protection, vials of holy water, ancient symbols carved into stone. They were desperate measures, but he had no choice. He wrapped the dagger tightly in cloth once more, ignoring the searing cold that burned through the fabric and into his skin, and placed it in the satchel. The forest loomed ahead, a dark expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. It was said to be ancient, older than the village, older than any memory. Deep within its heart lay a place of power, a forgotten altar where rituals had been performed in ages past. If there was any hope of breaking the curse, it lay there. He mounted his horse, the satchel pressed tightly against his chest, and set off into the storm. The journey was harrowing. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the dagger's whispers, which grew louder with each passing moment. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, shapes that seemed to shift and melt away whenever he turned to face them. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and every step felt like a battle against the darkness pressing in around him. "You cannot hide from me," the dagger taunted. "I am with you always." Thomas ignored it, focusing on the path ahead. The forest grew denser, the trees closing in like towering sentinels. Their gnarled branches reached out, clawing at him as he passed. He pressed on, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of the dagger was a constant, oppressive presence, and his limbs felt laden with exhaustion. After what felt like hours, he reached the clearing. The altar stood at its center, a circle of ancient stone pillars covered in moss and etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The air crackled with energy, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This was a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. He dismounted, his legs trembling beneath him, and approached the altar. The dagger's whispers became a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices that threatened to drown out his thoughts. He unwrapped the blade and placed it on the altar. The stone beneath it pulsed with a sickly red light, and the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of blood. "You think you can defy me here?" the dagger hissed, its voice filled with rage. "You are a fool." Thomas ignored the taunts, focusing on the symbols carved into the altar. He traced them with trembling fingers, feeling their power surge through him. Pain lanced through his body, and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The shadows around him thickened, their forms solidifying into grotesque shapes. They moved closer, their eyes burning with malice. "Give in," the dagger urged. "It will be easier." "No," Thomas whispered, his voice raw. "I will not." The shadows lunged, their cold hands reaching for him. He grabbed one of the protective charms from his satchel and held it high. Light flared, and the shadows recoiled, hissing in pain. But the reprieve was short-lived. The dagger's power surged, and the shadows pressed in once more, their forms twisting and writhing. Thomas's vision blurred, and he felt the daggers pull like chains around his soul. It wanted him to break, to surrender. He could feel its hunger, its need. It would consume him if he let it. "You will not take me," he said, his voice shaking. "I am stronger than you." The dagger's laughter was cold and cruel. "Are you?" "Prove it." He forced himself to his feet, every muscle screaming in protest. With a surge of desperation, he grabbed the dagger and lifted it high. Light exploded from the altar, blinding him. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. But the pain was excruciating, as if the blade were trying to tear him apart from the inside. "You cannot win," the dagger whispered, its voice soft and deadly. "You are mine," No Thomas gasped, his grip tightening. "You will never have me." With every ounce of strength he had left, he plunged the dagger into the altar. The ground shook, and a wave of energy erupted outward, shattering the stone pillars and sending the shadows scattering. For a moment there was silence. The air was still, the oppressive weight lifted. Thomas collapsed, his body trembling. He had done it. He had broken the blade. But as the light faded, he felt a cold dread settle over him. The shards of the dagger lay scattered around him, but the air was still heavy with its presence. The curse was weakened, but it was not broken. The spirit's hold remained, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike. "You cannot escape," a faint whisper came, barely audible but chilling. "I am eternal." Tears streamed down Thomas's face. He had come so close, but it wasn't enough. The battle was far from over. He rose to his feet, determination burning in his chest. He would not give up. He would find another way. The curse would not take him. Not today, not ever. With renewed resolve, he gathered the shards of the dagger and wrapped them in cloth. He would carry the weight of his ancestors' mistakes, but he would not be broken. The journey was not over, but he would face whatever came next with everything he had. The shadows whispered, but Thomas walked on, unbroken and defiant. Part 8. The final confrontation. The wind howled with a vengeance, tearing through the village with the fury of 1,000 unseen voices. Trees bent and creaked under the force of the storm, and rain lashed the ground like an unending barrage of needles. Thunder cracked overhead, reverberating through the earth and shaking the ancient stone shrine where Thomas stood. He was soaked to the bone, his cloak plastered to his skin, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed solely on the dagger, now glowing with an ominous red light that pulsed in time with the storm. It lay in his trembling hands, bound by chains that did little to contain its malevolence. The air around it crackled with dark energy, and Thomas could feel its hatred, its hunger, as a tangible force pressing against his chest. The dagger's whispers had become a roar, a cacophony of voices that spoke of blood and fire, of power and despair. They clawed at his mind, trying to tear away what little resolve he had left. "You cannot destroy me," the dagger hissed, its voice a blend of rage and mocking laughter. "You are nothing but a tool, Thomas." Just like those before you, he gritted his teeth, fighting back a wave of despair. "No," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "I am not like them." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing in a blinding flash of white. For an instant, the shadows that gathered around the shrine took on ghastly forms, twisted faces with hollow eyes and mouths frozen in silent screams. They surged toward him, drawn to the blade's power, their spectral hands outstretched. Thomas stumbled back, his heart pounding. The dagger's laughter intensified. "Look at them," it whispered, almost lovingly. "Your ancestors. They are here to welcome you." No, Thomas shouted, the word torn from his throat. He backed away until his heels hit the altar, a slab of stone once smoothed by centuries of use. This place was ancient, steeped in power that even the dagger feared. He clung to that hope, even as the shadows closed in. "I won't let you win," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. The blade pulsed in his hands, its light growing brighter, almost blinding. The shadows recoiled, but only for a moment. Then they surged forward, driven by an insatiable hunger. Thomas raised the dagger, the weight of it pressing down on him like a physical force. "I will end this," he whispered, more to himself than to the blade. With every ounce of strength he had left, he slammed the dagger onto the altar. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, and a burst of light erupted from the stone. The shadows screamed a high, keening wail that pierced the air and made Thomas' ears bleed. He staggered, his vision swimming, but he did not let go. The dagger burned in his hands, its heat searing his flesh, but he refused to release it. "Fool," the blade spat, its voice filled with rage. "You think you can destroy me? I am bound to you. The air around him crackled with energy, and the ground beneath his feet began to quake. Lightning struck the altar, sending sparks flying. The storm raged with renewed fury, as if nature itself were being torn apart by the dagger's power. Thomas fell to his knees, the force of it driving him down. The whispers became screams, a chorus of agony and fury that echoed through the clearing. Give in, the dagger demanded. Surrender, and I will end your pain. Thomas's hand shook, his grip slipping. The blade's power surged, and for a moment he saw himself standing atop a mountain of corpses, the dagger in his hand, his eyes empty and hollow. He saw himself consumed by darkness, his soul twisted and broken. No, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I won't let you take me. He forced himself to his feet, the weight of the dagger nearly crushing him. You will not win, he said, his voice raw with determination. He raised the blade high above his head, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. This ends now. With a primal scream, he brought the dagger down with all his might. It struck the altar and the world exploded. Light and darkness clashed in a blinding storm of energy. The ground split open and tendrils of shadow erupted from the dagger, rioting and lashing out. They wrapped around Thomas, burning his flesh and filling his lungs with fire. He screamed, but he did not let go. He could feel the dagger's rage, its desperation as it fought to break free. You cannot destroy me. It shrieked, its voice echoing in his skull. I am eternal, not anymore, Thomas gasped, his vision dimming. He pushed harder, forcing the blade deeper into the altar. The light intensified, and the shadows screamed again, a sound that shook the very air. The tendrils of darkness began to wither, their grip loosening. The dagger's glow flickered, its power waning. No, the blade cried, its voice cracking with fear. You will die with me. Thomas felt his strength fading, his body failing. But he refused to let go. If that's what it takes, he whispered, I will end you. The light around him grew blinding, and the shadows dissolved into nothingness. The dagger's glow sputtered, then dimmed. With one final surge of strength, Thomas smashed the blade against the altar. It shattered, fragments flying in every direction. A shockwave of energy rippled outward, sending him crashing to the ground. Silence fell, the storm died away, and the air was still. Thomas lay motionless, his body broken and battered. He could barely breathe, each breath a struggle, but the oppressive weight was gone. The whispers had ceased. The dagger was no more. He opened his eyes, the world a blur of light and shadow. The shattered fragments of the blade lay scattered around him, their glow fading into darkness. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by exhaustion, so deep it threatened to pull him under. But he had done it. He had ended the curse. A soft, familiar voice reached his ears. Thomas. He turned his head slowly, his vision clearing. A figure stood before him, faint and ethereal, but unmistakable. His mother. She knelt beside him, her eyes filled with tears. You did it, she said, her voice trembling. You broke the curse. Tears welled in his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. She placed a hand on his cheek, her touch cool and gentle. You were brave, she said. You freed us all. The other spirits appeared his father, his ancestors, all of them freed from the dagger's hold. They smiled at him, their faces no longer twisted with pain. Rest now, Thomas's mother said. You've earned it. His vision blurred again, and he felt himself slipping away. But there was no fear, only peace. He had done what he had set out to do. The curse was broken. The darkness was gone. As the last of the light faded, Thomas closed his eyes. The storm had passed. Part 9. Aftermath and Shadows. The storm's fury had finally subsided. The wind, once howling with the rage of 1,000 tormented spirits, was now a soft whisper rustling through the trees. The rain that had poured in relentless sheets had slowed to a gentle drizzle, washing away the blood and grime that stained the ancient stones of the shrine. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and ozone, charged with the aftermath of the battle that had nearly torn the world apart. Thomas lay motionless on the cold, slick ground, his body battered and broken. His chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths, each one a painful reminder that he was still alive. Every muscle ached, every bone felt as if it had been shattered. But he had done it. He had shattered the dagger. He had broken the curse. The memory of the final moments burned in his mind, a storm of light and shadow, the deafening roar of the dagger's death throes, the searing heat as it fought to consume him. He had given everything he had, and now he was empty, a hollow shell. But the weight that had pressed down on him for so long, the darkness that had haunted him, was gone. He could feel it, couldn't he? Thomas forced his eyes open, blinking against the rain that splattered his face. The sky above was dark and vast, stars barely visible through the dissipating clouds. He turned his head slowly, every movement a struggle. The fragments of the dagger lay scattered around the altar, their once blinding red glow now reduced to faint, pulsing embers. For a brief, blissful moment, he allowed himself to believe that it was over. "It is done," he whispered, his voice ragged and weak. It has to be. Footsteps approached, soft and hesitant. Thomas' heart lurched. He tried to move, to reach for the protective charms in his satchel, but his body refused to obey. Panic flared, but it subsided when a familiar face came into view. It was the village elder Elias, his expression grim and weary. The old man knelt beside Thomas, his gnarled hands surprisingly gentle, as they touched his forehead. "You did it," Elias said, his voice low and heavy with both relief and sorrow. "The blade is broken." Thomas tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. Then why he paused, gasping for breath. "Why does it still feel like it's not over?" Elias's eyes darkened, and he glanced at the dagger's fragments. They lay scattered across the altar, but their faint glow had not faded completely. "The spirit's bond has been weakened, but it is not gone," he said. Such darkness cannot be destroyed so easily. A cold dread settled over Thomas, more suffocating than the storm that had raged moments before. "Then what did I do?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "All of this. Was it for nothing?" The elder shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You have bought us time. The spirit's hold is broken. It no longer has the power it once did, but its essence lingers bound to the fragments." Thomas closed his eyes, despair washing over him like a wave. He had sacrificed everything, his strength, his sanity, his very soul to end the curse. And now he learned that it was not truly over. "There has to be a way to finish it," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't let this thing haunt us forever." Elias's expression softened, a glimmer of pity in his eyes. "Perhaps there is," he said. "But it will take time, research. The fragments must be kept hidden, protected. If they are ever reunited, the darkness may rise again." The thought sent a chill through Thomas's veins. "No," he whispered, the word a plea. I can't let it happen. You won't be alone," Elias said. "This burden is not yours alone to bear. The village will help. We will guard the fragments. We will keep the darkness at bay." Thomas wanted to believe him. He wanted to feel the weight lifted from his shoulders, to trust that others would share this burden. But he knew the truth. The dagger had chosen him. Its whispers had seeped into his soul, and even shattered, it still had a hold on him. The faint glow of the fragments pulsed again, a heartbeat of malice that refused to die. Thomas forced himself to his knees, ignoring the pain that tore through his body. "I need to see it," he said, his voice hollow. "I need to know." Elias hesitated, but he nodded. Together they approached the altar. The fragments lay scattered, each one humming with a dark energy that made the air around them feel thick and heavy. Thomas reached out, his hand trembling. He touched one of the shards, and a jolt of cold shot through him, so intense that he nearly collapsed. Images flashed before his eyes, visions of fire and blood, of rituals performed in shadowed places, of faces twisted with rage and despair. He pulled back, gasping. "It's still there," he said, his voice barely audible. "The spirit. It's still there." Elias' hand tightened on his shoulder. "It is weakened," he said. "It cannot harm you now." Thomas wanted to believe him, but the shadows that flickered at the edges of his vision told a different story. The spirit was not gone, it was waiting, watching, and it would never truly let him go. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and heavy. The forest around them was eerily silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Thomas stared at the fragments, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had done and what still needed to be done. "We must hide them," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "Bury them deep, scatter them. Whatever it takes," Elias nodded. "We will. But you must rest. You have done more than anyone could have asked." Thomas shook his head. "There is no rest," he said. "Not for me." He gathered the fragments, each one searing his skin with its cold touch. He could feel the spirit's presence in each piece, a faint whisper of what it had once been. It was weaker now, but it was not gone. And as long as it existed, he would fight. He would never let it rise again. The journey back to the village was long and silent. The people who had once feared and shunned him now watched with a mixture of awe and trepidation. They had seen the storm, felt the power that had shaken the earth. They knew something had changed, but they did not know the cost. Thomas moved through them like a ghost, his mind numb. He barely felt the hands that reached out to touch him, to offer thanks and comfort. All he could see were the fragments. All he could hear were the whispers. The weight of the curse was still there, pressing down on him, even as the world around him breathed a sigh of relief. Elias led him to a small, hidden chamber beneath the village's oldest building, a place of stone and shadow, warded against evil. Together, they placed the fragments within a sealed chest, surrounded by protective runes and symbols. The air grew colder as the chest was closed, as if the darkness within were straining against its prison. "It is done," Elias said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Thomas nodded, but he did not feel the relief he had hoped for. He knew this was only a reprieve. The darkness would wait. It would bide its time. And when it rose again, he would be ready. The villagers left him alone in the chamber, their footsteps fading into the distance. Thomas stood in the dim light, his gaze fixed on the chest. He could still hear the whispers, faint but insistent. He closed his eyes, willing himself to find strength. "Not today," he said softly. "You will not take me today." The chamber was silent, but the shadows lingered. Peace had been restored, but it was a fragile peace, one that could shatter at any moment. So the fight was not over. It would never truly be over. But for now, Thomas would carry on. He would guard the darkness, hold it at bay, and ensure that it never claimed another soul. With a heavy heart, he turned and walked away, leaving the fragments behind. The whispers faded, but they did not disappear. They never would.